Okay, welcome. Welcome to this first afternoon panel. I realize we're right after lunch, so people might be dropping in late. But thanks to all of you here already for joining our panel. My name is Griet Verhenneman, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Just 2 words on my own background. I combine knowledge resulting from years of experience as an academic researcher and a PhD at the Center for IT and IP Law at KU Leuven, and I combine that with hands-on experience that I've been building as a DPO of the biggest university hospital in Belgium, the hospitals of Leuven. But today, I have the honor to present to you on behalf of the Center of IT and IP Law at KU Leuven a fantastic panel. A panel that's composed of 4 speakers, 3 of them joining live, 1 of them joining hybrid. Hello, Tamas. 4 speakers with very different backgrounds who will discuss one topic, and the topic is, as you've seen, the secondary use of personal data for research purposes. With the recent launch of the European Commission's proposal for the European health data spaces, I dare to say that we are tackling a topic that has yet again gained a momentum. But stating that it would not have been topical in January, when we were originally supposed to have this panel, that would have been a sign of ignorance, of course, as, let's face it, patients, healthcare practitioners, researchers, industry, everyone has been pleading for more clarification, more harmonization of the regulatory framework on this topic. Yet, what we see is that it seems to be daunting to bridge strong research traditions, ethical concerns, fundamental debates on individual autonomy, requests for patient empowerment, distrust in commercial actors. It's proven to be a daunting task. And personally, I experience these issues around the secondary use, requests for secondary use every day as a DPO. You can imagine I'm confronted with a lot of questions on the use of data that have been captured in electronic health records. And I have to say that with increasing scientific work being done around the limitations of traditional safeguards, such as anonymization or informed consent, it seems to me that not only the number of questions is increasing, but also the frustrations in researchers seems to be building up. So I am very happy that these 4 speakers in our panel have agreed to share with you their expert knowledge on secondary use of personal data for research purposes. And I suggest that we don't waste any more time and we start off with our first speaker. We're starting off the session with the policymaker's perspective, and no better person to introduce us to that perspective than Mrs. Véronique Semine. Véronique is a legal officer in the Policy and Consultation Unit at the European Data Protection Supervisor, and being part of the EDPS, she contributes to advices on legislative and policy proposals provided by the European Commission and other EU institutions and bodies. And previously, Véronique worked in the Supervision and Enforcement Unit at the EDPS, and before that she also worked in private practice in Rome. As a background, Véronique holds a master's degree in European law from the Leiden University in the Netherlands and a bachelor's degree in political science and international relations from the University degli Studi Roma 3 in Italy. Véronique, it's an honor to have you with us, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much, Griet, and thank you all. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. My first CPDP panel in person. So it's much more exciting this way. So I'm really happy to be here with you all. So maybe I would start briefly. So the aim of the presentation on my side will be to provide for a bit of an overview of the work that has been ongoing on the side of the European Data Protection Supervisor and of the European Data Protection Board. and to combine this also with information as to what's coming next, and also maybe just briefly touch upon how the COVID-19 also pandemic has impacted, let's say, the work of the EDPB and the EDPS in practice, and how this has, let's say, highlighted the work that still needs to be done. So just briefly, I believe most of you are familiar with the difference between the European Data Protection Supervisor and the European Data Protection Board, but just for who is not very familiar with the distinction, I just thought of maybe highlighting indeed the main difference. So the EDPS is the independent supervisory authority responsible for ensuring the protection of personal data by EU institutions, agencies and bodies. And of course, the duties are laid down in the regulation that we call EUDPR, in the usual way of calling it. And we have indeed supervisory tasks of EUIs, of European institutions, agencies and bodies, and then consultative tasks. So we advise the EU legislator on proposals for new legislation, for example, the forthcoming European Health Data Space proposal, and cooperative tasks. So we are involved in the work in close collaboration with national data protection authorities. And in this sense, the EDPS is a full member of the European Data Protection Board, which is responsible to ensure consistent application of data protection law in the EU. It can indeed adopt general guidelines, advice to European Commission, for example, also in the context of joint opinions under Article 42.2 of the EUDPR, but also adoption of consistency findings in cross-border data protection cases and promotion of cooperation and effective exchange of information and best practices between the national supervisory authorities. So I would just then dive into the topic, which is indeed, I would like to start this by let's say, summarizing a bit the status quo of data protection and scientific research. So the entry into force of the GDPR has raised particular concerns, and this is not a novelty in the scientific research community. And it has created kind of two teams. So there's one team that believes that, okay, GDPR indeed threatens vital research activity, and another theme that says that the GDPR offers too much flexibility, and therefore it is, unclear what needs to be done. In this sense, the EDPS opinion, so preliminary opinion on scientific research and data protection, which was published in January 2020, provides some sort of clarification. So it was meant to provide some clarifications as to how to approach the topic. And in particular, the opinion, I will not go maybe into all of the details at this stage, maybe in the discussion phase if needed, but the opinion tried to clarify, indeed, also starting from, for example, the definition of scientific research, which is still quite problematic at this point in time. So in this sense, I would just maybe briefly state, for example, according to the preliminary opinion, so according to the EDPS view in this sense, the scientific research, we have attempted to provide for a definition based on three criteria. So the first one, where personal data are being processed. The second is where relevant sectoral standards of methodology and ethics apply, including the notion of informed consent, accountability, and oversight. And the third one is when the research is carried out with the aim of growing society's collective knowledge and well-being, as opposed to serving primarily one or several private interests. So this is an aspect that we believe could create at least some certainty as to ideally coming up with a definition that could then serve the work that is being done in this context. And then indeed the proposal, the opinion amongst others deals with indeed the principles of data protection that would be applicable in this context, but also focuses on consent as a legal basis for data processing. And here, as EDPS, we encourage, let's say, not to rely too much on consent as a legal basis, but to use probably informed consent as a human research participant as an appropriate safeguard. So not as a legal basis under the GDPR, but as an additional safeguard that could be useful then in that sense. And then, let's say the work since then has evolved. In that sense, this is just a small recap of in a way what the opinion wanted to highlight. And in particular that there is indeed a lighter regime for research that is justified by the importance of science for society, and that, however, this flexibility under the GDPR shall remain in line with the Charter. Still, indeed, as I mentioned earlier, many argue that indeed the GDPR has not achieved the desirable level of harmonization with respect to scientific research. And there we see also how the health data space also attempts to try and find a way to kind of solve or to aid in trying to find a way to harmonize a bit better this field. And we are aware that many divergences, for example, being in contact and in touch regularly with external stakeholders, is the difficulty also, for example, many a times of identifying the roles and responsibilities of the various stakeholders in the context of scientific research. So even, you know, the context both of, for example, clinical trials as such, but also other processing of health data. On the side of the EDPB, I will try and be a bit brief here. So here, the EDPB has done quite a lot to try and contribute to enhancing clarity within the meaning of secondary use of health data and scientific research. In particular, I would acknowledge the opinion on the interplay between the clinical trials regulation and the GDPR, which provides particular clarifications. In particular, I think one of the most important aspects of this opinion is the fact that all processing operations related to a specific clinical trial protocol from, let's say, the starting of the trial to the deletion at the end of the archiving period are understood, are considered by the EDPB as primary use of clinical trial data. And then there is a distinction with regards to the scientific research, so the use of this data in the context of scientific research. And so this is, I think, a very interesting opinion in order to understand a bit how these two interplay. And then, indeed, the EDPB also worked on, published in February 2021, a document in response to the European Commission for clarifications on the consistent application of the GDPR. This document is incomplete in a way. It leaves a lot of questions still open, and this is because indeed the COVID-19 pandemic has indeed made us made the EDPB and the DPS as such focus on particular topics. So I just outlined briefly the work that has been done. So we have particularly worked on the role of data protection in the context of the fight against the pandemic, but also use of mobile location data to monitor the spread of the pandemic, contact tracing applications, the body temperature checks, so digital COVID-19 certificates. And in this, in this context, maybe I would just leave you with what is that we expect next. What can you expect next on the side of, for example, especially from the side of the EDPB? So here we have our the guidelines on scientific research. They are expected in 2022. And they will address different issues, including, let's say, possibly a definition of scientific research, and then secondary use of data, including roles and responsibilities of the parties involved. And last but not least, of course, the European Health Data Space proposal has been released on 3rd of May, and the EDPB and the EDPS have been consulted jointly. So an opinion will be released hopefully very soon. And then maybe just, if I can, 1 minute to draw a bit my final considerations, also in light of the pandemic. So how the pandemic has greatly accelerated the digital transformation and increased the need for effective guarantees, but also, I think, for adequate interpretation of the concepts. We need to start. I was following the first panel this morning on regarding health data and let's say digitalization in general, and indeed the interpretation of specific concepts and finding definitions is important in order to then advance the work. And then indeed improve accessibility, effectiveness and sustainability of the electronic health systems, and that in particular we should keep in mind how data will need to aid, to assist, to work in order to assist the public good. And this, of course, in a lawful, responsible and ethical way. So I believe these are aspects that we need to keep into account, that we do as data protection authorities, as EDPS, but also as EDPB members. And indeed, that's it on my side. I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronique. We'll keep the questions for after the presentations of our different panelists. I'm first going to give the floor to Theodora Lalova-Spinks, who will share with us her conclusions from a study that she did on the legal framework on secondary use and some results of also empirical research. Theodora is a doctoral researcher at the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences at KU Leuven, and she's also affiliated to the Center for IT and IP Law. Theodora is a fellow of the European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer, or EORTC, and she holds a scholarship by the Research Foundation of Flanders. From background, Theodora holds an LLM in International and European Business Law from the KU Leuven and a Master of Laws degree from Sofia University in Bulgaria. I have to say I'm super excited to have Theodora with us today. Theodora, you not only helped me a lot with setting up this panel, every time we work together it also strikes me how passionate that you are about your research. The floor is entirely yours.
Thank you so much, Grit. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a huge pleasure to be part of, as well as similar to Veronique, my first in-person panel. So the excitement is quite big. So I will discuss, as Grit presented. Oh, is this working? Okay, it is working. So the results, the highlights from two international collaborative studies that I have been involved with. The first one it was the traditional desk research, focusing on the secondary use of personal data for scientific research in general, with a specific target as well on clinical research and biomedical research. There, the focus was on scientific reports, the legislation itself, and also it investigated the national frameworks via a questionnaire sent to national experts in 18 of 30 European countries. The second research that I'm going to use to illustrate in a more empirical way the findings of the first one, that was part of a mixed methods study involving a survey, an online survey, and semi-structured interviews. This survey was specifically focusing on clinical research, on clinical trials and investigations of medical devices. And it was focused on gathering the opinions, the experience with data protection compliance of, on the one side, academic sponsors of clinical trials, as well as pharmaceutical companies, so their legal teams, the DPOs. On the other side, the investigators, the physicians that are primarily working with the patients. And finally, the opinions of ethics committees, the ones that are evaluating the integrity of the research and providing a favorable opinion for the research to go. So in this study, we managed to cover, based on where our participants were based, 25 out of the 27 European member states, as well as opinions came from the UK. And the majority of people that were involved in the study, in the survey, that were the investigators. They showed the bigger interest. And in the follow-up interviews, that were the DPOs, the legal experts working with sponsors of clinical trials. So first, I will discuss a little bit the highlights when it comes to the compliance with the lawfulness principle when it comes to secondary use of data for biomedical research. And what we identified in the desk research study was that there are quite a few difficulties and challenges when it comes to deciding on the appropriate legal basis. This is in two parts, twofold. So first of all, even at the stage of the primary use of data, the legal basis that was going to be decided, seen as the most appropriate one, that has its impact on later on how the data could be or will be processed for the secondary use of data. And as Veronique mentioned, the current discussion at the EDPS and the EDPB is to discourage the use of consent as a valid legal basis, specifically in clinical trials, specifically under Opinion 3 of the EDPB. So the approach of the different EU member states, despite this opinion, are still quite different at the moment. There are countries that are still even mandating by their law that consent is used as the legal basis. And this creates quite a few challenges on the side of the sponsor. So how to choose the most relevant legal basis in the context of especially cross-border studies, because this could have its implications specifically on the one side on the rights of the data subjects. Different rights come attached to the different legal basis. It has also different implications for the interest of the controller themselves. And finally, for the feasibility of carrying out the research in terms of the compliance, the records keeping, and so on. Another related to this topic issue is the fact that ethics committees in clinical research specifically, in clinical trials, there has been anecdotal evidence that they would provide opinion, advice, and sometimes even mandate advice on data protection related issues and questions. And one example of this would be, for instance, indeed, what legal basis should be chosen by the controller, by the sponsor, or assessing the compatibility of the purposes when it comes to secondary use of data. And this question was not yet investigated. It has not been yet investigated and mapped in a very sufficient way. So actually, with the empirical study, that was one of the main aims that we wanted to check, to what extent ethics committees do provide advice on data protection, how they understand their role in data protection, even though the GDPR does not mandate such a role, and what is the typical advice that they would provide. And the results showed that indeed the majority of the stakeholders who took part in the survey reported that ethics committees do opine on GDPR-related text in the study protocols, so where the goals of the clinical trial, of the clinical study would be described. Also, the majority of the stakeholders reported that ethics committees would indeed advise, sometimes even try to impose, what legal basis should be relied upon, both for the primary use of the data, so really the clinical trial itself, as well as for the secondary use of the data for research after the end of the clinical trial. In order to show how this could provide some tensions, I'm using here the example of the three most often used legal bases, valid legal bases when it comes to clinical trials: consent, public interest, and legitimate interest of the controllers. And the opinions of most DPOs with which we discussed, both as part of the survey itself and in the follow-up interviews, was that on a Likert scale, from never to always, they would indicate that they use these three legal bases sometimes, later on discussing the interviews, really related to the case by case. They would not have a specific preference. They would try to follow as much as possible the advice of the EDPB and the EDPS when it comes to consent, most of them. But then again, that would be sometimes difficult because of the national issues, the national advice coming from the ethics committees or coming from what is understood into the law of different countries. And when it comes to ethics committees on the other side, they would report that their preference would always be for consent. So that was a quite interesting finding to have it as an empirical, shown into an empirical research. A second highlight that I would like to present to you is related to the purpose limitation principle and compatible use under the GDPR. So first of all, at this stage, even though our panel is called secondary use of personal data, it's good to keep in mind that under the GDPR, we don't even have the term secondary use. We speak about further processing of data for other purposes. And the concept is not yet at this moment defined at EU level. There is now, I see, a definition coming with the European Health Data Space proposal, but at the moment that we were discussing the studies, conducting the research, and even now before the European Health Data Space, there is still a lot of uncertainty how to understand it. And in our desk research, what we discussed and identified was that secondary use could be seen on the one side as compatible use, so really it's okay to proceed. We have done the compatibility assessment, or we rely on the presumption of compatibility, we can do the research. Or secondary use stricto sensu, in the sense of like non-compatible research. And a lot of questions could also stem when it comes to the identification of appropriate legal basis in compliance with the lawfulness principle for secondary use, specifically when we think of recital 50, and the fact that there the GDPR states as long as the research is compatible, the further processing is compatible, we can continue relying on the original legal basis. Thank you. So this has not yet been identified, whether indeed we can continue relying on the original legal basis or not. And there are a lot of questions stemming from this. A quick empirical illustration again. So in the survey and the interviews, we discovered that the majority of participants reported that they do conduct the compatibility assessment most of the time or always. And what was very interesting was that they do it even when they rely on the presumption of compatibility, so that they would see it as an additional safeguard to conduct it in full. In scholarship, we have a lot of discussion that the presumption provides a more lighter regime for the further processing of data when it comes to scientific research, and maybe then the compatibility test should not be done in full. We saw that a lot of the stakeholders prefer to do it in full. And also very interesting that they would report that ethics committees do provide assessment, like a specific check after the controller has conducted the compatibility test. And some of them would really prefer that the ethics committee it's mandated that they provide such a check in the future, because it allows them to feel less risk averse. I would go to my conclusions, because my time is up. One of the main challenge when it comes to secondary use of data is the fact of legal harmonization that we have already discussed in the panel. And both in the desk research and into the empirical research, this lack of harmonization was discussed at 3 levels. One, the obvious one is at the level of implementing the legislation, but there are 2 more levels at the level of interpreting the legislation, both by companies as well as the national data protection authorities, and at the level of ethics committees providing advice, even though this is not mandated under the GDPR, how this should work. In terms of conclusions, so we know we need a comprehensive solution to this lack of harmonization. Just as a point of discussion, maybe we can think about codes of conduct, and several initiatives are currently ongoing at the EU level. Also, the research identified that ethics committees do provide advice on data protection related matters, and this is currently done in an unsystematized way, in an unharmonized way, bringing more uncertainty for both researchers and the patients in cross-border studies in particular. So we need more mapping and discussion on that as well. A role, I think, should be delineated. And finally, we know about all the new legislative proposals coming to the fore. The Data Governance Act, the Data Act, and the European Health Data Space. It is still not clear how this is going to converge and interplay with what we already have in clinical research as a framework. So we should be vigilant, because it promises a lot, but maybe there are also more challenges to come. With this, I thank you very much.
Thank you, too. Thank you, Theodora. Is it working? Yeah. Now, thanks to the advantages of technology, it should allow us to introduce to you Dr. Tamas Bereski, who will speak for us from a patient perspective. Tamas has been working as a trainer, a course coordinator, a meeting facilitator, and a content developer for various organizations and universities. And he has done this building on his own experience as a patient. Having been HIV positive since 2003, Tamas served as a member of the board of directors of the European AIDS Treatment Group for almost 4 years. He also served as the co-chair of the European Commission Civil Society Forum on HIV and AIDS between 2013 and 2015. And since 2017, he is also a valued member of the British Medical Journal Patient Panel. Tamas holds a PhD on research into significance and perspectives of patient organizations in Europe. And currently, Dr. Bereski is working as an independent consultant and researcher with Padvocates, which is a patient-led consulting network in Germany. Tamas also coordinates the patient cluster in the IMI-supported big data project Harmony, where he co-develops the ethics framework. Tamas, I hope everything is going well. I understood that you cannot see us, but you should be able to hear us.
Yep, I do.
Do you want me to give you a signal when the time is almost up, or you'll manage?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, just interrupt me. Yes.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you. The floor is all
thank
yours.
Thank you very much also for the kind introduction, and I'm terribly sorry that I cannot be there with you, but I'm still not well enough to travel. What I brought for you today is it is indeed from the patient's perspective, but I wanted to bring you a practical example about how we've been tackling the different challenges around data safety and GDPR in the Harmony Alliance, the Harmony Consortium, which started 5 years ago. And actually GDPR was still quite new, and we faced major challenges in terms of how to shape the ethics framework in order to make sure that we comply with GDPR, but also satisfy the unique needs of a big data platform that was, on top of everything else, supported and actively promoted by the European Commission. So we were really between a rock and a hard place, and what I'm going to present to you today, very quickly, is a summary of what happened or how it's been going in the Harmony Alliance ever since. So, just a brief introduction to the Harmony Alliance itself. It is a network, a consortium, a public-private partnership set up by IMI, now IHI, in which 31 institutions have so far provided data from various hematologic malignancies from more than 23,000 patients, totaling at 45,000 data sets by the end of 2019. 23,000, a little more of those have already been confirmed by the end of 2019. Then the pandemic came and things slowed down a little bit, but this work is ongoing. And also there are some additional hematologic malignancies that came or became part of the Harmony scope. Which means that additional data sets are being integrated into the big data platform to create an overarching massive data lake that can be used, mined by researchers under a set of rules. And this set of rules also obviously includes data privacy, data protection requirements. So we understand that anonymization, which is essential in this case, is not a black and white issue. issue, and that's why I wrote this this slide for you, where we together with my colleague Jan Geisler have tried to outline what the different levels of anonymization can be, and how they relate to the applicability or non-applicability of data protection rules, but also to what extent they facilitate the level of analysis and also the level of anonymization. So that's what these different axes, if you like, or domains describe. Now, where harmony sits is the level of de facto anonymized data. So these data are, as I will explain in one of the next slides, are de facto anonymized. Having gone through a lot of deliberation and considerations in terms of what is secondary data use, and you could hear from Veronique that this is not that straightforward at all, and also from Theodora, and also having considered what is actually needed in order to be able to do meaningful research into hematologic malignancies, genetic markers related to hematological malignancies, and last but not least, also the effectiveness of various treatment options that are there in hematologic malignancies. Now, what are the fundamental principles for this de facto anonymization that we've been using in the Harmony Alliance? First of all, Harmony only accepts de facto anonymized data, so nothing else can get into the data set. This means that the direct or even indirect identification of persons is impossible unless with unreasonable effort. So technically, it is still possible to de-anonymize data, but it takes so much work, so much effort, so much time that it's basically impossible in the end of the day. Even if you use other big data mining tools from ours in order to crack the code, it would be still too time consuming and too expensive, in fact, to go back from anonymized to unanonymized data. Also, there still is an ethics committee associated with Harmony, and they and also the other related ethics committees working with Harmony, with their opinions and also a legal opinion, exclude that the data are qualified as personal. So that's how we've tried to tackle this issue that was mentioned by Veronique, and by the force of their contracts, all participants also adhere to the fundamental principles of on data safety, reliability, security, data protection, and anonymity, which also includes valid regulations. This is important because not all consortium members are from European Union member states, so we had to make sure that the rules apply also to those who are not necessarily governed by GDPR. Now, we also decided that there is, and there was a long debate about that no explicit consent is needed for retrospective studies because it would be unreasonable to demand this, considering the fact that a lot of the historical data are based on patients who have perhaps passed away. So it would be impossible to get explicit consent from them. However, for prospective studies, written consent from all patients is needed. And that consent must also include an explicit agreement to the use of their data for additional research purposes. So we try to avoid secondary and tertiary use of data. These terms, we said, it's additional research. There was also a lot of debate about what qualifies as secondary use of research or data, and obviously, which is something that matters to the patients a lot, there has to be considerations around what is the purpose of research. So time and again, we will come across patients, even patient communities, who will specifically exclude the use of that data for defense purposes or defense-related research or military-related research. So these are also considerations that we had to take into account. Now, how it happens in practice with the de facto anonymization, there are the personal data which are first technically anonymized through suppression of personal data, then generalization of the various categories, and also outcomes that are included in the data sets. And then there's also a step of perturbation that is complemented by certain strict limitations on who can access the data and how they can access the data. There's one, if you like, clearinghouse for this, which cannot be circumvented. And last but not least, there's also organizational and technical security measures implemented through policies, processes, and contracts. And at the end, in the end, what we get is de facto anonymized data, which I don't know why it's in German, but anyway, that's what you have. So that's how the Harmony platform actually works, and you can see that that the personal data and the part of the technical anonymization are provided by the data suppliers, and then the Harmony consortium, the Harmony platform, takes over and does the rest of the necessary steps.
Tamas, you're already at 10 minutes.
Yep.
You're already at 10.
All right. This is my last slide. So we believe that actually data should go to the people. That it's patients who own their data. It's their tissue, their blood, their health, their bodies, their lives. And so what GDPR originally wanted to achieve is to give data to the patients, to give control over their data. And that's actually what we will promote further on and have been promoting in Harmony as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamas. I'm sure we'll get some time during discussion to further consider some points that you wanted to make. Last, but of course not least, I'm happy to introduce to you Mrs. Marina Marcatou. Mrs. Marcatou will share with us the insights that she gained from building practical tools to support the secondary use of data. Marina currently works as a privacy counsel for OneTrust, a software company that provides a platform to operationalize privacy, security, and data governance. And at OneTrust, she leads the incident module within the privacy excellence team. And she's providing her expertise both to complying with internal incidents and advancing the incidents response product. Before joining OneTrust, she was an academic researcher on privacy, including its intersection with computer science research. And as a background, Maria holds an LLM from Tilburg University, and she is CiPP E and CIMP certified. Marina, thank you for your willingness to share with us your views from privacy and security perspective. And the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much. I don't want to be repetitive, but it's also my first panel, so like lots of girl power here. Yeah, so I think what is going to be different a little bit about my little speech is going to be that I'm going to take a very practical approach. I'm going to talk about you as a researcher. What are you supposed to do when you're lost? So hey, that's me. So 4 things. First, legal framework, then considerations, what difficulties do researchers and in general hospitals have to deal with. Third, opportunities, and it's going to sound a little bit like Tamas, like every risk is an opportunity, and then a little bit onto takeaways. So legal framework, I start with basically the phrase secondary use. About that, one thing that you probably all know is that research is very special within the GDPR. It holds a lot of exceptions because it's really cool. We want to do research, but it is risky at the same time. And like Theodora said, there's a presumption of compatibility which allows this secondary use to happen. So generally, secondary use of for research is widely accepted, even though it's not extremely accurately defined yet. Then personal data, everybody here probably knows what personal data is. However, personal data tends to be different whether you're in Europe or whether you're in the US, but let's focus on Europe for now. And I just basically said whether or not this data is sensitive is extremely case dependent because we're talking about biomedical research. If we're talking about someone's name, okay, not so sensitive, but if we're talking like Thomas mentioned somebody's tissue, that's extremely sensitive. So that's the only distinction I did for personal data because it has a different law or different article applicable to it, and it's good to keep in mind. And last, biomedical research, what was already mentioned by Veronique. It has to do with, there are EDPB opinions out there. Most recently, it was updated in February 2021, so definitely check that out because it's awesome and it gives a lot of context. So for example, broad consent, kind of bad, anonymization, really difficult to achieve and often not that useful. Like if you look at orphan diseases, diseases that only affect about 10 people in a decade, you really easily know who was who based on their year of birth or based on the age that they started developing symptoms, which are all extremely important for you to make those connections to study that disease further. So anonymization is often not really perfect for biomedical research because the data is less useful if you do achieve that absolute anonymization, or hey, you don't have anonymization if you still want them to be useful. Awesome. So that was sort of the legal background very quickly because everybody else already went very deep into it. So one law that I'm really excited about that is coming soon, hopefully, is the European Health Data Space Regulation. And the whole thing behind it is basically two elements. The fact that for individuals you have a platform. Personally, I'm Greek, I studied in the Netherlands, I work in London, I'm everywhere. So for me as a European citizen, it's going to give me the ability that I can have my data in one cloud protected by the EU, and it will have immediate translation whether I break my leg in Portugal or Lithuania. So really awesome for me. But also for researchers like the rest of the people on this panel, it's really an opportunity to tap into a much larger wealth of data. And if we go back to those orphan diseases, that's where it matters. If previously your research was only done in Belgium on Belgian data, expanding that to the rest of the member states and hopefully a little bit further in due time, you're really going to get essential data that's going to help protect all of us, literally. Life, biomedical research. So what is it, how does it work, and what are the risks? For that, I kept it quite general because, as we know, still a proposal. Hopefully we'll go through. But basically, we see the digital age of healthcare, where we talk about free movement of people across the EU, like I said, breaking my leg in Portugal, but also free movement of the data with them. Because if you have to leave part of you behind, namely your data, it will be really harder for you. So let's say I'm a French citizen that only speaks French. I would like to see if I could get a job in Berlin. If I have to leave all of my doctors behind, which is something that a lot of Greek people do, and I'm sure a couple of Bulgarians too, is basically that you have to go back. Every vacation you have, go to your doctor back home. And that really doesn't allow you to really integrate with this. Is it the same for Italians? That's yeah. So really, we're talking about the free movement of people, which is a fundamental thing within the EU. And then also a little bit on data protection, like promoting safe exchange of data, promoting control over your data. And last, the collaborative research that I mentioned, really supporting research and encouraging access to the data and use of that data. So, cool. You have this pile of data now. What are you supposed to do? As a hospital, as a researcher, where do you start? Because what this awesome law gave you is basically access to a huge platform with 28 times the amount of data that you originally had. So first, we're going to look at some considerations, the tough stuff, then some opportunities, which is the considerations but sort of flipped, and then some takeaways. So it's basically the agenda again. So what are the challenges? So first we can see just a simple example of what privacy policy do you show, which is also something that Theodora mentioned. If you're handling the same study in 5 different member states or in 5 different countries that have slightly different national laws, what are you supposed to show them? And that's definitely a challenge that has to do with dealing with data across different member states, which is Yeah, no, the considerations. Yeah, and then the second thing is also, how do you know what data you have? Because just like we said, you have this huge pile of data in front of you, a massive Excel or multiple Excels. How do you use that? How do you gain any insights out of it? How do you know what you're dealing with? And again, challenges for working with health data in the EU. Then also automation, which has to do with what information do you have and how can you get further use out of them. And then what if you lose it? And you see that all of these 4 points that I've mentioned so far have to do with essential elements that you can find in the GDPR or in general privacy laws that you need to figure out a way to comply with. So yeah, all of these are challenges, and now get ready to flip them into opportunities. So I call this One Trust Solutions because naturally, One Trust. But you can find a lot of companies that can help you out with this. And I definitely encourage all of you to do that because it's extremely important to make the best you can out of this data that you're suddenly going to have. And also make sure that they're protected, give control to individuals, all of that good stuff. So the first one is delivering the right notices. You really need to just know what are the laws across the jurisdictions, what requirements differ, and how can you put that into practice. I hope you can still hear me. Oh, I wasn't using the microphone. Oh, I guess I'm just really loud. And then it has to do with maintaining the records of processing. So basically knowing what data you have everywhere, which we commonly refer to as data mapping, because you map what kind of data you have. But that also, going back to orphan diseases, super excited about that. Well, not a good thing, but good that we're dealing with it. The fact that you can make those connections when you do have those records of processing and can make those links via automation. So basically, drop AI into it. First, make sure it's unbiased and sort of make those links that you wouldn't otherwise make as an individual with just your brain that might not be able to make the connections as fast as, those smart algorithms that we can develop. And last, incidents. Like Griet mentioned, I'm the head of incident and breach, so that's definitely very, it holds a special place in my heart. So if you lose that USB with those really, really sensitive personal health data, you need to be careful about it and follow the process that you have established with your company or with the software that you have purchased. Awesome. So what can you get out of OneTrust? I have too many slides. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize it because we have way too many products for me to explain right now. But as users start to demand more control and you want to give that to them, it's an opportunity to go beyond compliance. Like I said previously, there are those challenges that you need to meet in order to deliver on compliance and make sure you don't get those fines, but you can also have the opportunity to build some trust with them. The idea that you can have some transparency, choice, and control for them that is going to give you a better name as a corporation, but also help those individuals and also help yourself. Specifically regarding the challenges that I mentioned, you can figure out those regulatory requirements through software that you can find with OneTrust or again with other providers that just sort of has, through intelligence and, large regulatory research databases, you can detect and mitigate incidents, and assure that you are a trusted corporation. And moving on to the takeaways, because I saw that my time is done. Basically, biomedical research is extremely important, but also risky. The requirements of the law are often opportunities to go a step further, and help is out there, so reach out. I know we have a little tent in the central hall, so definitely feel free to visit.
Thank you, Marina. I think we've touched already upon a lot of topics that can be further explored, but first I want to give the floor to the public. Are there any questions for our speakers based on their presentations?
Hello, everyone. I'm a data protection lawyer from My Data Trust, a company advising audience company in pharma and clinical trial sector, and I'm really...
Just speak up a bit.
Okay,
Speak up because there's a lot of background noise.
Oh yeah, sorry. So my question is about those specificities, so those national specificities regarding the legal basis on the processing of data linked to clinical trials. And the fact that, for example, it's not easy to deal with in practice. And my concern is how to deal with that. The EDPB, for example, already think about a solution, a platform to discuss those things, because we have those national specificities because the GDPR allows it in the rules, so it's legal. So how to deal with that in practice? A platform to discuss on that, with also the ethic committees. And I have a second question, but I wonder if I need to wait an answer or to...
It is indeed a very, very, very good question. Right now, what I can say, because the guidelines indeed are not yet finalized, what I can mention, however, is that the EDPB is paying particular attention to that, and in particular, I think, in a way, the fact that the guidelines are not yet out is also good in the light of the health data space proposal, because I think the health data space proposal creates also some questions as to how, for example, it would interplay also with national laws already existing in that sense. So how then do we deal with this? We have a regulation, and then we also have national laws, and I think this is an aspect that is good. For example, that the EDPB is also indeed involved in a joint opinion on the proposal, because this is something that it will take into account when not only providing for the opinion, but also let's say implementing and finalizing the guidelines. So at this point in time, this is an aspect that is being kept in great account, because indeed we see the potential risks of having the GDPR allowing for national implementation of the rules with regards to scientific research, and on the other hand, a proposal that tries to solve these issues. Or also another question that may come to mind also when reading the proposal is also what to do in case of cross-border research activities. So how to combine all of that, and so this is something that I didn't really maybe give a complete answer, but indeed it's something that we are keeping in mind, and that we are working on to try and coordinate, in particular between the guidelines and then the legislation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, please, if you want to.
Thank you. Thank you for the great question. And myself as an academic, and also collaborating with practitioners, I'm also very much looking forward for the guidance. At this stage, so the big problem with the GDPR is the fact that in the end, it's not a problem, but it is the accountability of the controller to decide on the valid legal basis. So there is a lot of tensions coming on the one side from they should be the ones to decide, but then there would be a national law advising or mandating what to do. And then the other big problem for myself is that the ethics committees, that this role is not delineated at the moment, that they would still impose sometimes. You might not be able to proceed with your research if you don't accept the legal basis that they suggest. And it's not clear how this goes with the accountability of the data controller. So myself, for instance, I don't have a good question how to navigate this. You do it in the most practical way possible to satisfy the national obligations and to find the most feasible way for the best way for the patients as well. That's it.
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on that, Theodora, I know that ethical committees are very used to consent because of other legal frameworks. Do you think that also has a role to play?
Thank you very much, Grit. Indeed, so the inspiration that they would oftentimes push or motivate for consent is because of the sometimes still the confusion ongoing with the consent as the ethical requirement to participate in the research. So there is still a lot of work, I think, to be done as well on the training of the ethics committees themselves. There is a lot of national specificities, but to bring more awareness. And that was actually something that we investigated in the survey, asking them about data protection training. And it was very interesting in the sample, whenever we would have a lawyer sitting in an ethics committee, they would be advising against consent. Whenever it was representatives coming from a different backgrounds, unless there was training specifically done, they would always push for consent because that's it's 50, 70 years of tradition. So they would see it as for the benefit of the patient.
Maybe I will just pass the microphone because I took a lot of time. Thank you for answering my questions.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, two observations. First, on the issue about consent. A few years back, the DG Research, as a condition for their funding, was mandating in the clinical trial setting that you use consent only. That was a little contrary to everyone's hopes that the additional Article 9.2 legal basis would be invoked. I would hope that if the European Health Data Space Regulation is adopted, that DG Research would go back and adjust that because it's contradictory. The other point is about the conflict that you had mentioned. The GDPR, the very first word is general, okay? It is a regulation, but it's general and it's across scope. This is a sector-specific law which would take priority. It's lex specialis. And the member states would in fact be endorsing it through the council. So even though it's later in time, they would be agreeing to it. So unless there's an explicit contradiction with an existing national law, I would see the European Health Data Space Regulation taking priority, which I think many in this room would hope would be the case.
Maybe you will also want to pose a question, but I'll ask it anyway. So, Sebastian Bargeval from FPF, great panel. Thank you very much for your contributions. I was wondering, very short question, what do you think is the role that the recently approved Code of Conduct from the Spanish Data Protection Authority, precisely on this topic of processing data for health research, can have in bridging lack of harmonization or different interpretations across the EU, whether players can join and have some sort of certainty. Of course, Code of Conduct approved under Article 40 of the GDPR has a very formal and heavy weight in terms of compliance. So I'm wondering what is the role that the Code of Conduct can play in this case.
I can start. It's very. I mean, it's a very easy question in a way. Codes of conduct can play a very important role. Theodora also mentioned that in her presentation. We fully agree. As EDPS, we have always encouraged, because of this double, team leagues. Like, okay, the GDPR is a mess for us, but the GDPR instead helps us because it gives us a lot of flexibility. In between, there is also indeed always, as we have said as EDPS, there is a lot of margin for stakeholders, for researchers to play a very active role in that. And I'm very happy that you brought this up and that Theodora brought this up, because actually codes of conduct can do a lot to bridge this harmonization at EU level. So indeed, legislation can do a lot, guidelines can do a lot, but then I think sector-specific, indeed, codes of conduct can do a lot to try and identify some general, some common understanding of these issues, and that can also be useful then indeed for the work of the EDPB as such and the legislator. So indeed, it is a tool that is provided for in the GDPR that is not very often mentioned, but it is indeed essential, I think, also to gap certain difficulties and lack of harmonization.
Thank you very much, Veronique.
Yes, please, Tamas.
Yes. So it may sound as further complication, but in fact, it's a very interesting new trend, which is emerging from patient communities, and that's setting up data cooperatives by the patients themselves. There have been a couple of examples for that, also in the US, like the RareX community or the Path Biobank in Germany for breast cancer tissue samples. Whereby the patient organizations themselves create data commons, and they are the controllers of the data. And they also, in the form of a data cooperative, they will then do this, interfacing with everyone else who might need the data, and that also to some extent takes care of these ownership issues. So watch out for that. It's also happening. And again, this may sound as a complication, but in fact, it points towards simplification of things.
Yeah, maybe let's pick up on that topic of data ownership and database ownership for a second. I think we've heard it already in other panels today that data protection is not at all an absolute right. We all know that. But the balancing exercise between the individual autonomy of a patient versus general interests of society, as is often served by research, how do those two things compare? There was an interesting study made from a Dutch expert group, and it dates from October last year, but it was recently put in spotlights by the Dutch Minister for Digitalization. And that report stressed that there is not one comprehensive solution when strengthening the position of the individual in the processing of the data. But several ideas deserve further exploration. And they said the concept of ownership can be a source of inspiration, but is as such probably not suited to be applied to data. So any opinions on that?
Sure. That's a really interesting topic for me as well, because I always wondered, when you protect data, do you protect them because it's an extension of yourself and therefore a human right? Or do you protect it because it's a property right? And we've seen that in the US, which is, a country with big privacy momentum at the moment. They definitely go towards the side of it's your property right, it belongs to you, that's why nobody else can take advantage of you of it rather than you, and you have the do not sell button super hard. While in Europe, you take more the approach of it's an extension of yourself and therefore it deserves the same protection. But in the newest regulations, we do see that it's moving more towards a marketplace idea where this data can be exchanged and can be considered to be sold for monetary profit. So it's really interesting to see which direction it's going to go. But personally, I'm a big fan of a human right and an extension of yourself and protecting it as an individual.
That's what the patients say as well. Absolutely. Yes, very much so.
Thank you. On my side, so when it comes to data ownership, the way that I see it, I'm very much agreeing with Marina, because I see it more as a metaphor of how to organize our thoughts when we think about what would be fair towards the patient. But it has been already so much in past scholarship, in what we have seen in the EU jurisdictions, it's not the framework to actually implement at work. And it's also in contradiction with the spirit of the GDPR itself. So to me, ownership would not be the way forward. It would be, and we have colleagues like Charlotte Duckwing at KU Leuven that really looks into ownership as at the level of principles to give inspiration and to open the discussion how to organize, but not that to be the main focus or the main aim of future legislation. For me, what is very important at this moment is actually to better understand what we mean by data control and by true patient empowerment, data subjects empowerment, because at the level of the GDPR and all the additional instruments, it is there, it is in the recitals, we talk about data portability, but it's not yet fully defined in a really concrete way. And what exactly are the tools, how to operationalize it? What does it mean that the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, and the European Health Data Space puts the focus on we want to empower the patient, we want to empower the citizen, but at the same time, the main, for instance, with the Data Act, the main scope, it's still more about how the data is going to be used and reused by other actors. So for me, there is a lot of still questions and uncertainties there.
Any questions from the room?
Actually, the question of the... Does it work?
Not really.
It's coming, I think. Yes, it's coming.
It's coming.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's interesting because the question of owning your data. If you go to the Louvre, you see the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. Who owns it? Mona Lisa. It's her data. Or Leonardo da Vinci, it was the artist who did it, or is it the French state who actually owns the itself? So it's the same. If you look at your genetic data, my wife is a twin. That means that she has the same genetic data as her sister. Who owns it? So the question of ownership for me is not applicable to personal data. It's not something that you can use, and at least and even less in the health data space. No, I had more a question of for maybe EDPB, EDPS, because I worked with FPR for a long time on code of conducts. We prepared also standardized informed consent that was supposed to work in all of Europe. And then you have the CNIL that has a certain idea that if you are a pharma company, well, it's legitimate interest, which is, of course, your legal basis. If you are in Germany, we say, no, no, it's consent. So you do 2 informed consent for the 2 different countries. At the end, in Germany, you may end even with 17 different ones. And when you come to use this data again, 5 years later, because you want to pull data from different studies to advance science, then suddenly you have to deal with hundreds of different informed consent and then look what am I allowed to do with the data of this patient, and that you have a problem with the integrity of your database as a whole. So I'm really interested in if you are able to overcome these national differences.
That's a very good question, but that's the goal of the work that as EDPS, I mean, we are doing, you know, in the context of the work ongoing in the EDPB. It's very true, and I think also it is always it's always worth stressing the difference between informed consent to participate in a clinical trial than informed consent within the meaning of the GDPR, which is something that I try and do every time I speak about this topic, because it is indeed important to keep in mind, and then sometimes it's really confused, and then there is also the difficulty of the ethic committees, as Theodora was rightly pointing out. So this creates even more, let's say, stress, I think, on the side of the researchers. So this, yes, I mean, in short, yes, this is something that we are going to try and address in the guidelines. It's complex, even from the perspective of the EDPB, yeah, because this is a topic that is quite controversial. There is a lot of difference, and the EDPB is very much aware of it. So finding a common ground and trying to find a way forward is indeed the objective. I think indeed proposals like the EHDS one are going to kind of also stir the debate in a certain way. But indeed, I think this is something indeed that we really keep into account, and that should be sort of clarified, because of course it's a burden indeed to conduct research in that sense.
Oh, and if I can draw an extension from that, is that if you have such differences on a national level, and you need to be aware of how far you can take advantage of some pieces of data, then you can never get to the point of anonymization, because you're going to always require those individual files per individual. And the moment you have that issue that you need to have one entry per human, you can never really anonymize it. From date of birth, from the age that the symptoms started, all of this is possible to reverse engineer it and find who that human is.
Yes, we have time for one last question, I think. Yeah.
So they say that in every family there is a DPO, which is typically the mother, sometimes the father. I would like the panelists, as the last question, maybe to position themselves. How does this relate to the topic at hand and the harmonization of policies and the health data space? Thank you.
So just to make sure I understood, so the role of the DPOs in this context. Yeah. So in this context, I would say that it's very important, and I think this also touches on an important aspect, which is indeed that we should never forget a bit about the fact that accountability is a principle that should be kept in mind, and that sometimes, sometimes we sense also that scientific research community kind of, is kind of stalling until, there is a guideline or an example in the guidelines on controller processor about clinical trials, and then everything changes because it was an example that simplified the process. And there, I always try and say kind of like, okay, this was just an illustrative example to show how to, approach the concepts. But then it is also up to controllers and the accountability principle to do their own thing. And I think the DPOs have also a specific role to play in also identifying innovative solutions in terms of, for example, also of agreeing like joint controllership agreements. We sense also, for example, this panic mode, when it comes to, okay, we have to be joint controllers. This is like, it's too much. How can we deal with all of this? And then we say, okay, but it's also not the same level of responsibility. You can be creative in trying to address these solutions, these issues. But indeed, yeah, I would say fundamental in short, because they have a specific role that is very important. Sorry, it was very long.
Tamas, did you want to add anything on this last question?
I think that it's, I think there's maybe one important aspect here, also referring back to the previous conversation about like ownership or not. I think what is important for the patient community is, first of all, our bodies, our lives are not commodities. We will also not just silently sit and watch other people turning our lives into commodities. So I think that's a very important point. And in the end of the day, patients are willing to contribute to science with their data. It's just that they need to understand what happens to the data. So if there needs to be clear, understandable communication about what's going on, and then it works. So it's not like patients are, stopping or stalling this process, but that sometimes we feel that there's too much effort poured into sorting out the legal stuff and making sure that the compliance departments are happy, instead of explaining to the patients what's going on and what should happen. Because then if they understand, then they also cooperate.
I think that's a beautiful message to close, but I would like to give the word to the two colleagues here if they want final remarks on the question.
Sure, I would definitely say that I agree with everything that we've said so far, but definitely if I could stress one message is that I think very much with my hands. I really like solving problems, and one thing I often encounter in my position, both as in OneTrust and previously at Tesla, inside a company or consulting it, is that a lot of researchers fear that they're going to hear no. So they already cut down what their plan is in hopes of that would be accepted. Like, let's not go beyond this because it's definitely going to be a no. But don't do that. Just go with exactly what you want to do, and we'll figure it out. We'll figure out what the law says. We'll interpret it in a really great way, and we're going to get it done. But definitely, we can do it.
Thank you, Marina. Theodora?
Thank you very much. As an ending point, yes, I completely agree with everything that was said, and I would like to echo one of the main postulates of the patient advocate movement. So no decision about us without us. So I would like to see this more shown in data protection as well, in terms of the patient empowerment and the data control. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask your applause for our panelists?